All the images in this presentation are my own, taken in the fall of 2006 when I lived at the Outer Banks for a semester. At the time, I was studying many of the adverse effects of diverse cultural and political problems on the banks, as well as some of the initiatives different organizations were undertaking to potentially alter the state of things. At the time, these images simply served to document my experience of the banks, which was very positive, but with an undercurrent of regret, guilt, and dismay because of the environmental problems I saw. But I wasn't looking for problems when I took these pictures. I spent my time exploring the topos and developing my sensitivity to the psychogeography around me. Just as Ulmer's Myami's problems are not local, but, quote, these local breakdowns have their origins in a global structure of multinational corporations and the entire history of colonialism, end quote, so too the problems that plague the Outer Banks are wider in scope than its topos. Issues like tourism, recreational versus vocational fishing, the shipping industry, and overdevelopment. Of course I saw these things and took pictures of them, but not with the intention to use them in my story. So it's possible that the punctums I captured fit Ulmer's bill. Ulmer quotes Jameson, who points out that it is impossible to capture the scope of problems this big. They are unrepresentable, but the absent cause may find figures that reveal them in distorted and symbolic ways. So I'm going to talk about some of the problems at the Outer Banks and then show some pictures that have punctums for me. This is an image of a dune at the Outer Banks. The Outer Banks had no dunes naturally, so the Army Corps of Engineers built them using these fences. They prevent the banks from moving naturally. They would more be wanting to migrate toward the shore with sea level rise. This is the tallest dune at the Outer Banks. It's called Jockey's Ridge, and it's over 140 feet tall, but it's receding because of this. So the Army Corps of Engineers has anchored the Outer Banks in place, and therefore it can't migrate and move like it's supposed to, and so the dune is shrinking. This little creature is called a nutria. They're invasive species at the Outer Banks, and they get into the marsh and they tunnel underneath things and upset root systems and make it difficult for certain other animals to move around and survive in the wild, so they are also a problem. I had the opportunity while I was at the Outer Banks to do an air tour, and so this was taken of Nag's Head from a Cessna. You can see just how enormous the houses are, how closely packed together they are, and these are all abandoned for the majority of the year. They're 6 to 8 bedroom homes just completely left vacant. Here's a bulldozer that's replacing a dune in its previous location after a storm event. There were several other pieces of large equipment out there moving the sand around. So once again, the banks naturally want to migrate, but people don't want them to because then they would have to move. It would not be a good place to put a house. This is the Oregon Inlet. It's the farthest north inlet on the Outer Banks, and it's the only inlet north of Cape Hatteras. So it's a really important inlet for shipping, but it naturally wants to close, and so the Army Corps of Engineers has to dredge it almost daily to keep it open for shipping. Obviously not very good for the environment. This is an old abandoned life-saving station, the only one at the Outer Banks that was all African American. And rather than seeing fit to turn it into a historic site or anything like that, they've just let it go, and it's slowly being consumed by the elements, including the sand. You can see it's getting buried here. This is a plover. This is not a piping plover, but a black-bellied plover. Birds like this nest on the sand and lay their eggs on the sand directly. The piping plover is the rarest of all the birds at the Outer Banks, and they're all threatened by human activity on the beach, which can cause their eggs to be destroyed, such as vehicles driving on the Outer Banks. Vehicles are allowed to drive on many beaches at the Outer Banks to bring the fishermen in their trucks right up to the water's edge, so they can put out their lines right there in the surf. And that's incredibly problematic for the ecosystem, very destructive and dangerous for the birds. Recreational fishing is also a big deal at the Outer Banks, and part of the reason that tourism is so huge. But recreational fishermen cut down on the supply of fish that there are for the vocational fishermen to catch, and so it's getting increasingly harder for families to make their livelihoods by fishing at the Outer Banks. Like this gentleman is Willie, and he owns the Full Circle Crab Company in Columbia, North Carolina, and his industry is being hurt by the recreational fishermen, as is this gentleman from Wanchese who's making a boat here, and these folks from Ocracoke. All of their livelihoods are threatened by recreational fishermen. Tourism is huge at the Outer Banks. They obviously are able to fill up all of those 6 to 8 bedroom houses all season long, from Memorial Day to Labor Day, and the rest of the time it's all just vacant, and all the bars are quiet. So on to Ulmer's categories for the My Story. The first one is family. This was my family while I was at the Outer Banks, and we spent all of our time together. We cooked together, we watched Grey's Anatomy together, we suffered together through mosquitoes and all sorts of other hardships. This is us in our educational capacity. This is our classroom, which was in a house. This is us well, not us particularly, but we participated in lots of community efforts. So serving at an event, and then cleaning up the sound and finding creatures like this octopus here. And also this is a park ranger from the Cape Hatteras National Seashore who's got some baby turtles. We helped out with some of that. And this is the Gulf Stream. You can see how very blue the water is. And here is Brittany, who caught a dolphin and right before that had thrown up. So she had been seasick and managed to pull herself together enough to reel in that big fish. Here's everybody traipsing out in the marsh, so in our more vocational capacity. And this is Jake, and you can see a little bit of a shipwreck sticking out there. So hard at work on the Sound. And this boat belonged to a friend of ours. Obviously it had a bit of an accident and is completely burned out. But I feel like these images really capture my experience at the Outer Banks and how important it was in my life, so maybe I'll be able to turn them around and use them in my actual My Story presentation.